Imagine standing at the threshold of a structure so magnificent, so utterly unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen, that the very act of beholding it stole the breath from your lungs. Imagine the air thick with incense, the golden walls blazing in the Judean sun, and 10,000 voices lifted in a single cry of worship that rolled across the hills of Jerusalem like thunder given a human soul. Imagine the moment when a king who had poured 11 years of his life, the treasure of an entire kingdom, and the labor of 180,000 men into a single divine ambition, finally stepped back and looked upon what he had made, and wept. This is not legend. This is not mythology, dressed in the robes of religion. This is history, recorded in fire and stone, in the ancient texts of Kings and Chronicles, in the memory of a people who believed, with every fiber of their being, that what stood before them on the summit of Mount Moriah was nothing less than the house of the living God. This is the story of Solomon's Temple. To understand why this building shook the ancient world to its foundations, you must first understand the world into which it was born. The year is approximately 966 BCE. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah are united under a single crown, a crown worn by a man whose name has become, across 3,000 years and 3 major world religions, synonymous with wisdom itself. Solomon, son of David, third king of a unified Israel, inherited a kingdom that his father had bled to build. David had been a warrior. Solomon would be something rarer and, in some ways, more powerful. He would be a builder. But before Solomon could lay a single stone, before the first cedar log could be felled in the forests of Lebanon, before a single craftsman could lift a chisel, there was a dream that had to die, and a dream that had to be born in its place. David, the shepherd king, the giant slayer, the man after God's own heart, had wanted more than anything to build a permanent house for the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark, that gold-covered chest containing the stone tablets of the law, the staff of Aaron, and a jar of manna from the wilderness, had traveled with the Israelites for generations, housed in a portable tabernacle, a tent of meeting that moved from place to place as the people moved. To David, this was an indignity. He lived in a palace of cedar, he told the prophet Nathan, while the Ark of God dwelt in curtains. He wanted to change that. He wanted to build something permanent, something worthy. But the answer that came back through the voice of the prophet was devastating in its clarity. David had been a man of war. He had shed blood, rivers of it, in the campaigns that secured Israel's borders and established Jerusalem as the capital of a unified kingdom. And so the task of building the temple, according to the divine instruction recorded in Chronicles, would not be his. It would belong to his son, a man of peace, a man whose very name, Shlomo in Hebrew, shared its root with the word for peace, shalom. David accepted this with the grace of a man who had learned, through decades of triumph and catastrophe, that not every dream belongs to the dreamer. But he did not step away from the project entirely. In one of the most moving acts of paternal devotion recorded in the ancient world, David spent the final years of his life preparing everything he could for the son who would finish what he could not begin. He gathered gold, 3,000 talents of it from his own personal treasury alone. He gathered silver, bronze, iron, timber, and precious stones. He drew up architectural plans. He organized the priests and the Levites. He rallied the leaders of Israel to pledge their own wealth to the cause. And then, in the first chapter of Chronicles, he called his son Solomon before the assembly of all Israel and spoke words that still resonate with the weight of a father passing the most sacred possible torch to his child. "Be strong and courageous," David told him, "and do the work. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the temple of the Lord is finished." And then David died, and Solomon was king. If you are finding this story as gripping as the ancient world found this moment, take a second to subscribe to this channel, because this is only the beginning, and there is so much more ahead. Solomon was young when he took the throne. Exactly how young is a matter of scholarly debate, but the biblical text suggests he was likely in his late teens or early 20s, a detail that makes what he accomplished in the years that followed all the more staggering. But Solomon did not begin his reign with the temple. He began it, wisely, with a question. At Gibeon, where the great bronze altar of the tabernacle still stood, Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings, an act of worship so extravagant it reads almost like a statement of intent. And that night, according to the account in 1 Kings, God appeared to him in a dream and asked him what he wanted. What would he request, if he could request anything? Solomon did not ask for wealth. He did not ask for military power, long life, or the destruction of his enemies. He asked for wisdom, specifically for a discerning heart to govern the people and to distinguish between right and wrong. The answer was so unexpected, so selfless in its framing, that according to the text, it pleased God deeply. And so Solomon received not only the wisdom he asked for, but everything he had not asked for as well: riches, honor, and a long life, contingent on his faithfulness. It was with this wisdom that Solomon now turned to the greatest project of his age. And the first challenge he faced was not spiritual. It was logistical. Jerusalem, for all its significance as the city of David, was not a natural center of industry or trade. The hills of Judea were not heavily forested. The Israelites were not, by tradition or training, a people of great maritime commerce. But Solomon's kingdom shared borders with one of the most commercially sophisticated civilizations in the ancient Near East, the Phoenicians of the Lebanese coast, whose capital at Tyre was ruled by a king named Hiram, a man who had been a close ally and friend of David. Solomon wrote to Hiram. The letter, preserved in the 7th chapter of 1 Kings, is a masterpiece of diplomatic correspondence, respectful, direct, and utterly clear about what he needed. He told Hiram about his intention to build the temple, explained that his father had been prevented from doing so, and asked for cedar and pine logs from Lebanon, along with skilled craftsmen, particularly workers trained in the use of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, men who knew how to work with purple, crimson, and blue yarn. He offered to pay the workers whatever Hiram considered appropriate and proposed to send food in exchange for the timber. 20,000 cores of wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of olive oil annually for the duration of the project. Hiram's response was enthusiastic. The two kings sealed the agreement, and almost immediately, the machinery of the ancient world's largest construction project began to grind into motion. Let that scale sink in for a moment, because it is genuinely difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp. Before a single stone was laid on Mount Moriah, Solomon conscripted a labor force the size of a small nation. 30,000 men were sent to Lebanon in rotating shifts of 10,000 per month. 1 month working in Lebanon, 2 months at home. 70,000 men carried loads. 80,000 quarried stone in the hill country of Judea. 3,300 foremen oversaw the work. In total, 180,000 human beings were organized, fed, housed, and directed toward a single purpose. This was not slave labor in the way many people imagine. The biblical text distinguishes clearly between the Israelite workers, who served in organized conscription shifts and returned home regularly, and the descendants of non-Israelite peoples who remained in the land, who performed the heavy carrying and quarrying work on a more permanent basis. But whatever the precise social structure of this workforce, the sheer organizational achievement of coordinating so many people across such varied terrain without the infrastructure of the modern world is breathtaking. The stone for the temple came primarily from quarries in and around Jerusalem itself. Ancient tradition identifies a massive underground quarry beneath the northern part of the Old City, a place known today as Solomon's Quarries or Zedekiah's Cave, stretching hundreds of meters into the bedrock beneath the city. Here, workers armed with copper and iron tools would have spent their days in flickering torchlight, cutting enormous blocks of limestone from the living rock. And here is one of the most remarkable details in the entire account. The stones were cut to their final dimensions at the quarry. No hammer, no chisel, no tool of iron was heard at the building site, according to the account in 1 Kings. The temple was to be built in sacred silence. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every block, and these were massive, some measuring several meters in length and weighing dozens of tons, had to be cut with such precision at the quarry that it would fit perfectly into the structure without any additional shaping on site. This required measurement, planning, and craftsmanship of an extraordinarily high order. Archaeologists working in the region have found evidence of exactly this kind of prefabrication in ancient Israelite construction, and the sophistication it implies speaks to a level of engineering competence that continues to impress modern scholars. Stay with us, because what comes next, the interior of the temple, and the extraordinary materials brought from the ends of the known world to fill it, is where this story truly becomes something beyond imagination. The design of the temple, as described in precise detail in 1 Kings chapter 6, followed a tripartite structure that was consistent with other ancient Near Eastern sanctuaries of the period, while simultaneously transcending them. The building itself was oriented east to west, approximately 30 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 15 meters tall. It sat on a raised platform on the summit of Mount Moriah, the same mountain where, centuries before, Abraham had brought his son Isaac in the most harrowing act of faith in the biblical narrative. The entrance faced east, toward the rising sun. Before it stood two massive bronze pillars, free-standing, not supporting any weight, their existence purely symbolic. These pillars had names. The one on the right was called Yakin. He establishes. The one on the left was called Boaz. In him is strength. They stood 18 cubits tall, each capped with an elaborate capital of lily work and chains, wreathed in pomegranates cast from bronze. They were statements, in metal and artistry, of the theological convictions of a people, that this God was a God who established, who strengthened, who endured. Beyond the pillars was the Ulam, the portico or entrance hall, an open porch that served as a transitional space between the ordinary world and the sacred precinct within. Through this passed the priests and Levites who served in the temple, moving from the profane to the holy with every step. Beyond the portico was the Hekal, the main hall, the holy place, where the daily rituals of Israelite worship were performed. This room contained the altar of incense, overlaid with gold, upon which fragrant offerings burned morning and evening without ceasing. It contained the table of showbread, also overlaid with gold, where 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes were arranged in 2 rows and refreshed weekly. And it contained 10 golden lampstands, 5 on each side of the room, each one a branching tree of hammered gold whose flames never went out. casting warm, flickering light across walls that had been lined, floor to ceiling, with cedar from Lebanon, and then covered entirely in gold. The gold. Let us pause here, because the gold alone is almost incomprehensible. The cedar panels that lined the interior walls were covered in gold. The floor was covered in gold. The chains that marked the entrance to the inner sanctuary were gold. The carved cherubim and palm trees and open flowers that decorated every surface were gold. The altar of incense was gold. The lampstands were gold. The bowls, the wick trimmers, the sprinkling bowls, the dishes, the censers, all gold. Hiram of Tyre, the master craftsman sent by King Hiram, worked specifically with gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and his work represented the highest artistic achievement of the ancient world. Beyond the Haikal, separated by that golden chain and a great veil, was the room that gave the entire building its reason for existence. The Deber, the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in every direction. In the theology of ancient Israel, geometric perfection signified divine perfection, and a perfect cube was the most perfect of all geometrical forms. This was the room where heaven touched earth, where the divine presence dwelt among the people, where the Ark of the Covenant would rest. In the Holy of Holies, 2 enormous cherubim, angelic figures carved from olive wood, stood with their wings spread wide, each wing 5 cubits long, so that together they formed a canopy of outstretched wings spanning the entire width of the room. Their wingtips touched the walls on either side. Their inner wings met in the middle, above the place where the ark would stand. And they were covered in gold. Everything in this room was covered in gold. Solomon's artisans worked for 7 years to bring this vision into existence. 7 years of quarrying, transporting, carving, casting, gilding, and assembling. 7 years of Hiram's craftsmen working alongside Israelite artisans, of timber rafts floating down the Mediterranean coast from Lebanon to Jaffa, of an ancient supply chain operating at the very limits of what the ancient world could organize and sustain. And when it was finished, when the last panel of cedar was set in place, when the last lamp was trimmed and lit, when the great bronze pillars were erected before the entrance, and the enormous bronze sea, a cast basin so large it could hold 11,000 gallons of water, resting on the backs of 12 bronze oxen, was set in the temple courtyard, Solomon stood before the completed structure and understood, perhaps for the first time, what his father had dreamed of. The dedication of the temple was not a quiet affair. It was an event of such magnitude that it compressed into a single ceremony everything the nation of Israel had experienced, believed, and hoped for across 5 centuries of its existence. Solomon summoned the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral families, to Jerusalem. And then he commanded that the Ark of the Covenant be brought up from the city of David, from the tent in which it had rested since David had brought it to Jerusalem years before. The priests carried the ark on its poles, as the law required. The Levites walked before it, and as they moved through the streets of Jerusalem toward the new temple on Mount Moriah, the sound of music filled the city. Lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets, performed by a choir and orchestra of 120 priests, all sounding their instruments in perfect unison. The account in Chronicles says that the trumpeters and singers joined as one to give praise and thanks to the Lord, and that the sound of the trumpets and cymbals and other instruments rose so powerfully that it could be heard far beyond the walls of the city. The priests brought the ark into the Holy of Holies. They set it beneath the outstretched wings of the great cherubim, and then they withdrew, and a cloud filled the temple. A cloud so thick, so dense, so entirely overwhelming that the priests could not perform their service. They could not stand. They retreated. And Solomon, standing before the assembled people of Israel with the temple blazing at his back, spoke words that have echoed across 3,000 years of human history. The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. What followed was a prayer, the dedication prayer of Solomon, recorded in full in 1 Kings chapter 8, that stands as one of the most extraordinary pieces of ancient religious literature in the entire biblical corpus. Solomon knelt before the altar with his hands spread toward heaven, and he prayed for his people with a comprehensiveness and a compassion that belied his youth. He prayed for the individual who came to the temple wronged and seeking justice. He prayed for the nation when it would be defeated in battle because of its sins. He prayed for the land when drought and famine came. He prayed, and this is the detail that has struck commentators across the centuries, even for the foreigner, the person from a distant land who had heard of this God and came to pray toward this temple. Do whatever the foreigner asks of you, Solomon said, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you. The prayer finished. Solomon rose, and then came the sacrifice, 22,000 cattle, and 120,000 sheep and goats offered over the 14 days of the dedication ceremony. The bronze altar in the courtyard was too small to accommodate the volume of offerings, and the sacred fire spread across the entire courtyard, sanctifying the ground itself. On the 8th day, Solomon sent the people home, and the account in 1 Kings says, with quiet economy, that they went joyful and glad in heart for all the good things the Lord had done for his servant David and his people Israel. If this story has moved you the way it has moved countless generations before you, we would love for you to like this video and share it, because this is exactly the kind of history that deserves to be remembered and told again and again. The temple that Solomon built did not stand forever. Nothing built by human hands endures without interruption, and the history of this building across the centuries that followed its completion is a story of glory, degradation, reform, destruction, and longing that runs like a scarlet thread through the entire subsequent history of the Israelite people. But those chapters belong to other stories. What matters here, what this particular chapter of history demands we understand, is what this building meant in the moment of its creation. In an ancient world filled with temples dedicated to gods of storm, fertility, war, and death, Solomon's temple was dedicated to something revolutionary. An invisible God whose moral demands shaped not just ritual behavior, but the entire structure of human community. The God of Israel did not need food offerings because he was hungry. He did not need human sacrifice to be appeased. He did not live in the statue placed in the inner room. The ark itself contained not an image, but a text, the words of the law given at Sinai, the covenant between a people and their God, written in stone. The temple was not, in the theology of its builders, a cage for the divine. Solomon himself acknowledged this in his dedication prayer. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? The building was not intended to contain God. It was intended to be the place toward which his people turned, the axis of their spiritual world, the center of their identity, the place where they could bring their joys and their sorrows, their gratitude and their guilt, and know that they were heard. And for the laborers who built it, the 80,000 quarrymen who spent their days in the dark beneath the hills of Judea, the 30,000 men who walked the roads to Lebanon and back, the craftsmen who gilded cedar panels and hammered bronze into impossible shapes of beauty. It was something even simpler than theology. It was the work of their hands made holy. It was the knowledge that their sweat and skill and endurance had been spent in the service of something that would outlast them. That, long after the foreman's voice had faded, long after the last chisel had been set down at the quarry, long after they themselves had returned to the dust from which they had come, the building they had made would still be standing on the mountain, its golden walls catching the morning light, its priests keeping the flame alive, its presence a reminder to every generation that passed beneath its shadow, that a king had once gathered a nation around a vision of the divine, and, against every odd and obstacle the ancient world could place before him, had brought that vision into being. This was the Temple of Solomon. This was the house built for the name of the Lord. This was the moment when a young king looked at a mountain, and a dream, and the labor of 180,000 human beings, and dared to believe that what his father had imagined could, in fact, become real. It took 11 years. It took more gold than most kingdoms would ever see. It took cedar from a foreign land and bronze from the earth, and wisdom from above. It took a king who prayed before he planned, who listened before he spoke, who understood that the greatest thing a human being could build was not a monument to himself, but a house for something greater. And when it was finished, and the cloud of the divine presence filled the room, and the voices of 120 priests rose together in praise that shook the stones of Jerusalem. In that moment, every chisel strike, every aching back, every log dragged down from the mountains of Lebanon had its answer. The house was built, and it was very good. Thank you for watching this journey into one of the most extraordinary chapters in the ancient world. If this documentary moved you, informed you, or made you see this story in a new light, please subscribe to this channel. Because we are committed to bringing history to life in exactly this way, one story at a time. The ancient world has so much more to say, and we are only just beginning to listen.